Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on creating a coaching culture in organisations. My name's Jean Balfour. I'm Managing Director of Bailey Balfour, based in Singapore. We're an organisation consultancy providing executive coaching and leadership development. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Really happy to say that joining us today, we have people from all around the Asia Pacific region and also extending into the Middle East and North Africa region. So you're very welcome to join us in what for some of you will be lunch. For me, it's lunchtime. For some of you will be morning, some of you mid-afternoon. So welcome, and I hope you'll find this a valuable way to spend the next hour or so. So to say a little bit more about us, we are an ICF coach certification provider accredited with to provide coaching programs globally. As well as that, we also provide executive coaching, and I personally do a lot of executive coaching. We do some work in diversity and inclusion and looking at how to create more inclusive workplaces, and we also help organisations to look at coaching skills and how to develop coaching skills for leaders. And we believe that all of these actions are underpinned by a coaching approach and a coaching culture in organisations. And so today I'm going to share a lot about what we believe a coaching culture is and how you might develop that. And we'll cover this by talking a bit about the business case, why we see a business case for creating a coaching culture. We'll talk a bit about what is it. So what does the research say? What are the academics saying about what they think it is? Then we'll bring it back to reality, if you like, and say, so what does that mean for managers? I'll share a couple of case studies of things I've been involved in, and then we'll talk really in a little bit of detail about actually what do you do to bring about a coaching culture. So let's do a couple of polls and get some input from you. So the first of these polls is asking this question: do managers in your organisation ask questions first and tell you what to do second? Do you agree or disagree with this statement? Managers in your organisation, do they ask first or tell second? So thanks. I can see quite a few of you voting in the poll. Thank you. I'll close it in a few seconds, and then we'll see what the results say. Brilliant. Thank you. So I'll share the results now, and I'm really happy to say that actually many of you are working in an organisation that has a coaching culture, because at its absolute simplest, this is what we see, is that if managers and leaders are asking questions, are being curious before they're telling, then that's at the heart of it. So that's really heartening to see that, and I hope that today what we'll do is help you to build on that. Let's do our second poll. Which of these behaviours do you think best demonstrate a coaching culture? So which of these behaviours do you believe you would see if there was a coaching culture in your organisation? So it's great. Thank you to those of you who are voting again. We'll leave it open for a few seconds. Now, I would like to say that whilst we might believe that some behaviours demonstrate a coaching culture more than others, none of these are wrong. So all behaviours are appropriate and relevant in all situations, but actually some are more likely to demonstrate a coaching culture. Okay, so I'll close the poll now and share the results. And what you'll see is that we see many different answers here. So many of you are saying listening or asking questions. And certainly those are the things that we teach most on all of our coaching programs. In fact, we see listening right at the heart, showing empathy as being important, and also offering guidance. And it's interesting that nobody's talked about instructing, because of course, offering guidance is about offering ways and opportunities, whereas instructing really is more about telling. So thank you for sharing that. So let's, as I said, talk a bit about the business case. Why do we believe that it's important, and what is the research telling us? Well, there's a few things about current trends. Many of you will be working in organisations that have new performance review systems. So these are changing the old performance management systems and moving to more of a coaching conversations, more regular reviews. And underpinning those is the ability of managers to be able to have good conversations, to be able to relate well with the people they're leading. Secondly, and in some ways, perhaps most importantly, millennials, many of you on this call today will be millennials, saying actually we want more feedback and we want our leaders to demonstrate more of a coaching approach. The research is actually saying that they want that, but they feel they're not getting it. And so they're really feeling like there's a bit of a disconnect. Of course, this also means that they are likely, as they grow into leadership positions, to be much more likely to be managing and leading in that way. We also see a drive for more on-the-job learning opportunities. Certainly anybody involved in providing learning and development to organisations will know that the story is that it's much harder to get people away from their day jobs into the learning environment. And so it's much more important in a way that we find ways to coach people on the job. And then finally here, we also see that managers are being asked to be less commanding, perhaps to move towards more inclusion, involvement and participation. And I believe that actually if we want to create inclusive workplaces, that's a part of it, that if managers are being empowering and inquiring and curious, that helps to create an inclusive work culture. This study, the International Coach Federation, or the ICF, have been conducting studies for the last 4 years on different aspects of a coaching culture. This is the one that they did 2 years ago that was looking at building a coaching culture with managers and leaders. And one of the key findings from this study was that they saw that coaching conversations led to increased performance and productivity, improved relationships and teamwork. That's really about how the work gets done, but perhaps really critically decreased stress and increased resilience. As an executive coach, I know that one of the primary topics that comes up is how can I be more resilient in the face of an ever increasing pressure in the workplace. So we see that there's a need to help have coaching conversations to help people to manage that. And then we also see other parts that it's good for time management. It helps onboard people. There's good research to show that when people are onboarded into an organisation, if they have a good experience, they're more likely to stay longer, and coaching plays a part in that, and also better decision making. So there are wide-reaching impacts of creating a coaching culture in organisations. This was another study a few more years ago that was showing that organisations that had a revenue growth that was above their industry peer group were much more likely to have a strong coaching culture. So, not 100%, but more likely to have a strong coaching culture. And we'll talk a bit about what might be the reasons for driving that, for making that difference. This is the most recent study from the ICF. And in this study, they were looking at what's the impact on change management of having a coaching culture. So you will know the stories that we hear about how difficult it is for any change initiative to truly be successful. And so they were questioning, when you are leading change, which of the activities are most helpful? And if you look at the slide, what you'll see is nearly all of the activities that are helpful are directly connected to conversation, relationship, or coaching one way or another. So the 4 direct links are having some work group coaching with a professional coach, or one-to-one coaching, your manager using coaching skills, or team coaching. But actually all of these others are there as well. Meetings, having face-to-face time. Action learning is about learning on the job with others. Being in learning labs, so you get the opportunity to talk about it. Having stretch assignments, being in the workplace and experiencing it. mentoring programs, and peer networking. And when it starts to tail off, curiously, is when we move the learning into the classroom and or onto the web. We do a lot of work in developing people in a virtual environment, but we believe in doing it live like this so that people have the opportunity to interact. And that's because we see these figures. We see that when learning is happening, not in relationship, it's much harder for people to embed that learning. So here we see that a coaching approach in organisations is most likely to help with change, and we all know that change is constant and not transient at the moment. So what is a coaching culture? We're going to do a slightly different exercise now, and this is giving you an opportunity to use the question and answer tab. We don't have the chat function here, but we do have the question and answer, and you can type these in here. So if you think of the best manager you've ever had, what was perhaps one behaviour that they did that created this as a good experience? If you think about your best ever manager, what was it they did? What was their behaviour that made that a good experience? I will see the questions that you ask, and I'll share them. I won't share who asked the question at any stage. So if you find the Q&A button, it will have a question mark on it, and type your question in there, and I will answer them. So I'll share them. So think of your best manager. What was it that they did that created this good experience? So let me tell you about my best manager. He's somebody actually I'm still in contact with. And what he did was at moments, particularly, I think I particularly remember at moments in my career where I had a particularly challenging time, he always took the time to sit down with me and talk me through what had happened, what my feelings were. So he really was a coaching manager. I have since worked with him in other settings and seen him in action with others, and he does it all the time. He takes the time to listen. So thanks. Many of you are typing in. So people are saying they walked me through mistakes. So they helped me come to terms with them, resolve them. They were inclusive and transparent. And I believe there's a strong connection between inclusion, bringing me in a coaching approach. They gave me an opportunity to strive or to fail. So there was a sense that actually failure was good because it meant that we were actually learning from it. Helped me to think for myself and make decisions. They showed empathy. They gave me feedback in a positive and constructive way, a really core part of a coaching approach, I believe. Let me try something first. Yeah, so good coaches are curious about helping somebody think for themselves first, try it first, see how it goes. Somebody else saying mentored, provided constructive feedback. So thank you. And what you can hear from all of those is that they're both about the relationship, but many of those are about helping me grow as a person, as an individual. They're about helping me learn and grow so I become more effective in my role. Somebody said, always ask you what you think rather than giving the answer. So this is what we believe is all of those really core parts of a coaching culture. So let's start with what is culture. Well, this phrase, which we think is attributable to Peter Drucker, is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So what we see is that the culture of an organisation are the behaviours, the things that actually happen. They're not necessarily the espoused visions or statements, but they're actually the actual behaviours that happen every day. And Edgar Schein, who I had the privilege of studying with a few years ago, has written extensively about organisational culture. And he gives this model where he describes the kind of artefacts. They're the very visible structures and processes in the organisation. They might be things like the hierarchy or the performance management processes, things like that. We've then got the espoused values. So that will be the values that the organisation says it has, it espouses, it talks about, but also the strategies, the philosophies and the goals. But Schein's premise really was that actually what drove everything and what impacted all of that were the basic underlying assumptions and I believe therefore behaviours. These were the unconscious, taken for granted beliefs, perceptions, thoughts, and feelings. So if I take one of the examples that we talked about before, if I hold a belief in the organisation, even though we might not talk about it, that helping people to grow and learn is important, then I will do that. I will just demonstrate that in my learning. But we as an organisation could talk about being a growth mindset organisation, and then if people make mistakes, we don't help them to learn from it. And therefore, we're really not growth minded. So in order for organisations to have a coaching culture, it actually is much more important that it's about what people do and less about what we've written on bits of paper about what we think is a coaching culture. And therefore, the development of the culture may be not even in writing a strategy. It may be looking for ways to help people bring forward coaching behaviours in their daily activities. And I think that at the heart of all of this is this constant tension between the task, the job at hand, and relationships in the organisation. And as the workplace has become more pressured, what I see and observe is that we become more task-focused and less relationship-focused. However, I think and the research is certainly showing that it's actually critical that we focus in the relationship space, because without that, actually, it's harder to get the job done. And I'm going to give you two examples of this. Some of you will work in industries where safety is of critical importance. Some of you on the call today are from oil and gas or healthcare or transport maybe. And any of these industries have a high need for safety. And we know from research that's been done about incidents and accidents, disasters that have happened, that 9 times or 9.5 times out of 10, the analysts of that incident will track it back to communication breakdown. They will say that what happened was that the communication broke down. And I've had the privilege of working with both of these industries and seeing this as how they've taken that research and put it into practice. So in the airline industry, they saw that when airline pilots, who often have a preference for introversion, they would get on the plane, perhaps just say hi to each other, fly the plane, and that was all fine if nothing went wrong. But if something went wrong, they hadn't built a communication channel in order to talk to each other very quickly about what they would do to solve the problem. And so now in the airline industry, there's a requirement before every flight for there to be a briefing. And part of that briefing is safety, but it's also about bringing the team together and introducing themselves to each other and connecting and building a bond. The same thing also happens in healthcare. And there's now something called the WHO checklist, the World Health Organization checklist. And again, I've seen this in practice in the operating theatre now before anything can happen. The surgeons and all of the wider team, the nursing staff, the operating assistants are expected to stand together, introduce themselves to each other, and just talk about what's going to happen. They have to connect and build the relationship. So here we are in two incredibly task-focused professions, and we see that they've actually seen that communication, connecting, and relationship is actually fundamental to the safety. And so I think that the rest of us actually need to take heed that actually relationship is so fundamental to how successful we'll be at work that it's important that we take the time to build those relationships and connect. So underpinning all of this for me is that I believe that organisations are essentially relational. Very little gets done without relationships. Even in our time of artificial intelligence, we know that those computers, the programs have been built through teams working together. They didn't happen in isolation, and those teams had to relate to each other in order to build those systems. We see that when relationships break down in organisation, productivity stalls or change stops or accidents happen when communication breaks down. We know that's there. I have a friend who says that when there's a break in a code, when people are doing computer coding, that if something's wrong with the code, it's usually because the coders didn't speak to each other. The developers weren't talking to each other about that particular code. It's often less to do with the quality of the developers that is happening. So underpinning all of this, I think, is that a coaching culture helps to support effective relationships. So what is it? Well, Clutterbuck and Megginson have written extensively about mentoring and coaching in organisations, and they're saying that it's the predominant style of managing, and it's where a commitment to grow the organisation is embedded in a parallel commitment to grow the people. So it's we see that this organisation can't grow and develop without growing people as well. This from the Centre for Creative Leadership have just published a new white paper on the coaching culture, and in this white paper they describe a coaching culture as not being just about doing coaching, and I really agree with that. It's about having the conversations that may not usually happen across functions, across levels, to make sure that we understand and can act in ways that amplify collaboration, agreement and alignment. It's not just about the exchange between a coach and a coachee, but it's about how everyone in the organisation interacts with each other in their everyday conversations. And this is so true. A coaching culture involves coaching. It involves some coaching conversations, but actually they're happening in isolation. If we don't then use a listening and questioning approach with each other, then we're not really creating that type of culture. So it exists when employees believe that learning is critical, when leaders use a non-directive leadership approach, when decision-making is devolved, when managers are using a coaching style, when they're developing others. But there's a couple of other places where it happens. We're big fans of peer coaching. We believe that if I'm able to have a coaching conversation with a direct colleague, then that can be really helpful. And also, I want to perhaps have a mentor. And even though mentoring is slightly different to coaching, that's also somewhere where a coaching culture can be part of what's happening. So it's all about moving the coach culture from telling to asking. And actually, at its simplest, that's what it is. Along with that, it's about looking for ways to stop me solving the problem for you, but to being curious and seeking solutions with you. It's about me not assuming that I know what's going on, what's right, what your situation is. It's moving from that to being really curious. I had a coaching conversation with somebody recently, and I came into the conversation. I noticed my own assumptions about what the person would want to talk through, and where the angle would go. And of course, that wasn't what they needed at all. They needed something really different. And it's really important that we, in a coaching culture, learn to listen for that. So we learn to stop talking over people and to listen to each other. And then perhaps critically, that we move from a kind of apathy or a bit of distance with each other to empathy with each other and understanding people's situations. Underpinning the development of a coaching culture, I think, is Carol Dweck's concept of what she calls a growth mindset. And Richie wrote really beautifully about it in her book called Mindset, which I'd really thoroughly recommend. And in this book, she describes two different types of mindset. She describes a fixed mindset, which is one that we might believe that we either have a talent or we don't have a talent, that it's kind of finite. So, for example, I often hear people say, well, I'm not very good at maths. So that's a finite, it's fixed. I'm not good at that. I'm good at that. It's a kind of separate state that we have, where we have strengths and we have weaknesses, and they're fixed. The concept of a growth mindset is that those are much less fixed and they're more fluid, and that we will see challenges and opportunities, and that we'll be looking for ways to learn and develop new skills. So we'll take something that we think, actually, I'm not very good at that, and we'll have a good attempt at learning. And her research, and looking at the research of others, found that it's actually true that we really can develop in pretty much all areas, including developing our own intelligence. And the piece for organisations, which I think is strongly linked to a coaching culture, is that people in growth mindset organisations, employees say they're more likely to see trust, they're more likely to feel ownership for the organisation, they're more likely to say the company supports risk-taking. And in environments where we need to move quickly in organisations, that's fundamental, and critically, that more likely to foster innovation. So you'll be beginning to see that the connection between all of these really does support a coaching culture. And there are two kind of ways of just describing this. The first is that the fixed mindset, as I've begun to say, is about kind of looking right, doing the right thing and working hard and saying, I stick to what I know. I'm good at that. I'm not good at that. Whereas people with a growth mindset, organisations with a growth mindset are embracing challenges. They're looking for learning when they receive criticism, and they're basically holding this truth that I can learn anything. Now, I've worked with people in the past who are really struggling because they feel that they have a bit of a fixed mindset. They're not sure they can. And I believe my role as a leader is to help them believe that they can learn, and that that can happen largely through using a coaching approach to leadership. So it's really saying that in organisations and in people development, we want this growth mindset, because if we do that, we're more likely to have people in the organisation who are ready to move on up rather than having to look externally. And then finally, on this piece, we of course hear that phrase that people don't leave organisations, they leave managers. And certainly one study that I've seen looking at an organisation, in this case, they were looking at why women had left the organisation, and they tracked it back to the predominant reason being the quality of conversation between that woman and her line manager, whether or not her line manager was a woman or a man. So it's actually really important that we create spaces to help people to have coaching conversations. I'm going to just pause here and see if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask up to this point. So if you do, you can type them into the Q&A box, and I'll keep an eye on that to see. So if you have got a question, do type it in here. I'll keep going, but I'll keep an eye on that for this next space. So one other piece that I just want to bring out here is, I've already talked a bit about this. I believe that there's a strong connection between inclusive organisations and coaching. And many of you will be working with your organisations to help create more diverse and inclusive organisations. And we're struggling, actually. I've just seen some the latest McKinsey Lean In data from America, where they've looked at how as the US, it's only American data, progressing on the number of women into leadership, and it's stagnated. It hasn't moved for a few years. So not much change is happening. And if we believe, which I do, that part of the way that we help to overcome bias and build connections with people is through empathy and getting to know them, then a coaching approach supports that. It helps me build a connection with you, even if you're different to me, and then I can build that connection, get to know you, and I'm more likely to overcome bias and to get a shared sense of identity. There's a few questions here, so let me answer. The book Mindset is written by Carol Dweck, D-W-E-C-K. Somebody's asked, do you think a coaching approach will work with all employees? Well, I do believe it will, but some people will come to a coaching approach really naturally. They'll say, great, you're not going to tell me what to do. You're going to let me work it out for myself. Really happy to do that. Some people will come and find it much harder because they come either with a mindset that says, I expect my managers to tell me how to be and what to do, or maybe when they're early in a new job or they're new in their career, they'll actually need some more guidance. So I believe that what we do with people in those stages is we maybe need to use a hybrid of coaching and either telling or guiding. We talked about guiding earlier, in order to help bring them into that conversation. I had a conversation with a Japanese colleague who was talking about how she was helping her Japanese colleagues to engage more with coaching, and she said it was about describing it, spending some time talking about what a coaching approach was and how it was different to the way they'd managed and led previously. And then they had a go. So they were very explicit about what they were doing, rather than kind of just moving to asking questions and then expecting people to shift with you. So I do believe that we sometimes have to help people. In some organisations, if they commit to building a coaching culture, they'll actually run development programs for everybody, not just the managers on how to coach, but employees on how to come into an organisation, how to take on a growth mindset. Somebody's asked, do you think, is there a hybrid mindset combi depending on the situation? Yeah. So Carol Dweck described fixed mindset and growth mindset as being a bit binary, and I don't think it's so binary. And also I see in myself that in some things I might have a fixed mindset. I'm no good at learning languages, might be a fixed mindset for me. In other areas, I've got a growth mindset. And so I don't think it's quite as binary as she's kind of suggested. Do people of different generations have different requirements of coaching? Yes. Or different expectations of these? Yes. So the statement here is, for example, millennials being less patient in what they're trying to achieve and how to manage that. So we do see some differences in that space. And first of all, it may be that we have to help millennials to understand the constraints of what the situation is, and then use a coaching approach to work out how we help them grow and develop. So, for example, we know organisations are flatter than they used to be, so it's harder to have a promotion, which, 20 years ago, if you came into an organisation, you may be towards your mid to late 20s would have expected to have a promotion, but that's getting harder because organisations are flatter. But that doesn't mean we can't coach millennials or coach younger people or older people to look for other opportunities to learn and grow, to look for some sideways moves, to be a bit creative with it. So I think we have to think more creatively about it. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the impatience can mean that impatience is because I only get to talk to you once a month as my manager, and maybe we just need to have shorter, briefer coaching conversations more regularly to help them to learn and grow and feel like there's some progress happening. It's interesting. So a leader who believes on growth but does not encourage coaching, how can we convince them? Well, certainly some of the studies that I've shared with you today, the International Coach Federation has a number of studies that are demonstrating that, Centre for Creative Leadership also writing extensively about that. I would share with them some of the studies and help them to see that the connection is really strongly there. There are some leaders who are very nervous about moving from a tell culture to an ask culture because they're frightened about, will they lose control? Will people do the wrong thing? What will happen? And we maybe need to help them see and learn in small doses, maybe do some pilots, do some small touch things to help them feel that the confidence is there, that this isn't going to mean that they lose the way. If I'm a leader, maybe in my mid-50s, I've grown up in a particular leadership style. It'll depend also on country culture. Every country culture has a different view about this. Then it'll be hard for me to change, actually. And so we may need to be guides in helping people to see that. By the way, one of the best ways of doing that with a senior leader is to get them an external executive coach, because once they've had an experience of coaching, that can help to change the conversation. How much exposure and training on psychological issues do coaches have so that they recognise a problem when somebody's depressed? Well, certainly in our coach training, we teach people a method of seeing whether it's something that they as a coach are qualified to deal with, or whether they should perhaps help the person seek guidance. All accredited coaches sign a code of ethics, which has a very clear outline of what it is that helps them to understand where that boundary is. We talk about it on our coach training program quite a lot. People will raise questions about it. They might bring examples, and we help them to understand what the best approach. But somebody raised it on the program on Monday night. What do? I think the person who's come to me actually has a deeper problem than something I can deal with. So good coach training helps people to understand that. And somebody said, to what extent does unconscious bias impact coaching? So enormously, because we're all impacted by unconscious bias all the time. So we'd be kidding ourselves if we didn't believe it was going on. But we know from a number of studies that when people build connection and empathy, actually bias slips away a bit, not completely. And so if, as a coach, I believe my job is to build a strong, trusting relationship with the people I'm coaching. And part of that will mean that we build a good, strong bond and empathy. And in that, I certainly see that my own assumptions and biases slip away, and I get to see the person for more of who they are. Thanks for those questions. Fantastic. Let's move on to the next stage of our webinar. So looking at an organisational coaching culture. I thought I'd share with you a couple of quotes from people who have been on our program about how they've experienced the journey. These are people who have been on our accredited coach training program and who are leaders, and what's the impact on them of learning some of these skills. So this is one person who said, I came to the realization that I'd spent most of my professional life listening to answer rather than simply listening to people around me. I tended to lead my clients to solutions and sought to solve their problems directly rather than walking them to their own solutions through listening, replaying, and simply being present. So I'd learned to truly listen and be there, and my colleagues have observed that I had a more considered, thoughtful approach, and team members are viewing it favourably as supporting their development. And I've left this piece in after some initial resistance because as one of you asked, not everybody's ready. And I think that's true. We see that. Here's another statement from another leader who said, simply put, doling out advice is not a good approach for coaching. Being a people manager, in order to resolve the issue of the over-dependent team and overwhelming quantity of the work, taming the advice monster is my key development area. That means the desire to give advice. Positively thinking, training myself to be more capable to develop the mind of my team, not just the skills through coaching, will allow me to allow them to get that feeling of mastery, autonomy, and purpose. So underpinning all of a coaching approach to leadership, I believe, is listening. And Rachel Naomi Remen, who writes about empathy and listening in healthcare, has this beautiful quote. The most basic and powerful way to connect to another person is to listen. Just listen. Perhaps the most important thing we can ever give each other is our attention. A loving silence often has far more power to heal and to connect than the most well-intentioned words. And I think that we do well as leaders to work on our listening first and foremost. We know from so many studies that when employees say, I felt listened to, even though they didn't do what it was that I wanted to do, I was listened to, and that was great, and I felt empowered. So for me, listening is really the fundamental piece that underpins a coaching approach. And it's about how do we listen in meetings, how do we listen to disagreement, how do we listen to each other on calls in every space. So a coaching approach which underpins this basically is seeing an individual as capable and valuable. So we believe that individuals are coming to work with a skill set, they're capable to learn as well as capable to do the job. And so we're helping them learn and develop and create and innovate. And where does that happen? Well, it happens mostly, actually, in coaching moments. So I talk about corridor coaching. This is because I worked in a hospital for a long time, 1 day a week as a coach for doctors and leaders in the organisation. And they would say sometimes, I'm too busy, I'm too busy. So we developed this concept of corridor coaching where they would bump into somebody, the person would say, what should I do about X? And the person would say, what do you think you should do about X? And that is a coaching conversation in those moments, just to shift from what do you think you should do? Of course, it's also happening in one-to-ones. Regular one-to-ones are a core part of this and other management conversations, but there's lots of other places. I'll talk in a bit about how can we create meetings, how can we run meetings that include a coaching culture. I've already mentioned peer coaching. You can obviously bring in external coaches, or many organisations are now developing their internal coaches and getting them accredited so that they've got people in the organisation. Mentoring is another way of creating space for coaching conversations and then working with teams to help them develop. And what does it mean for managers? Well, first of all, Sir John Whitmore, who is widely credited with making the GROW model public, said that coaching is unlocking a person's potential to maximise their performance. It's helping them learn rather than teaching them. And so that's what we're inviting managers to do. And this lovely spectrum of coaching skills from Miles Downey is suggesting that what it's important we do is see if we can move a bit from push, the instructing and giving advice, more to the non-directive end of pull. And just to reassure you, some of you may be thinking now, well, do I have to do that all the time? Actually, the research says that it's a balance. It's a one-to-one. It's an equal ratio. As long as you're sometimes asking, it's okay to sometimes tell. So it's not that you have to move your whole style there. I once had a hilarious conversation with an obstetrician who was asking me, does this mean that I just, in an emergency, have to ask questions? So I explained that no, emergencies were not a coaching opportunity. The coaching opportunity is afterwards, but in the emergency, we're not coaching, we're telling and directing. So you will use this spectrum of skills, and people in the organisation with a coaching culture will use the spectrum, but coaching culture organisations have more of the non-directive than they did in the past. We also believe, underpinning this, that a few other things for managers. First of all, the manager doesn't have to be the expert. They don't have to know everything, because by coaching, they are going to help people come to their own solutions. This enables them to step back. We've talked about asking, using listening and questioning, and helping people solve their own problems. And in meetings, it can happen in this way. So we can focus on questions. So often we'll have lines on a meeting agenda that says budget, marketing, P&L, whatever's on there. And what is it that we're focusing on? And one very effective way is just to shift that to a question. So here's an example. What does the Q3 P&L tell us about the strategy for Q4? Now we're curious. We're not just looking at Q3 and going, wow, that number's a bit off. We're looking at Q3 and saying, what does this mean for us? What do we do about it? You can work with ground rules in a meeting. So you could have a conversation and say, what are the ground rules that we want to help us to feel like we've got opportunities to ask and be a bit more of a coaching culture? That's things like inviting people to listen without interruptions. You can go around the group, ask everybody's opinion, invite quieter members to contribute, or be asking people to be curious and ask questions. And of course, you can introduce peer coaching into meetings. Sometimes this helps, particularly if you've got a lot of quieter members. Asking people just to take 3 minutes, break into pairs, have a discussion. What do you think are the key elements of the strategy for Q4? Have that discussion in pairs, come back to the meeting. Immediately, you've got more engagement. And those are just a few examples of how you might begin to think about a coaching approach to meetings. Peer coaching is also very powerful because it creates an environment, and it can be less intimidating, I think, than some other coaching environments. And in peer coaching, what you do is you help people to meet together, and they might decide that they're going to meet once a month for the next 3 months to think about some goals, either to help them to improve their performance or to work together on an issue, or to get unstuck on something. So it can also be a very powerful tool. So we're moving into the last piece now about how do you create a coaching culture. And I want to share just a couple of case studies of how I've seen this happen, or these are examples of things that I've personally been involved with. So one was working with a UK hospital, where in the hospital they started with working with external coaches. That was people like me. And in my case, I worked in the hospital for 1 day a week, and people had open access pretty much. The chief exec would sometimes say, can you see this person or that person? But it was an opportunity for them to have a coaching conversation with me about something that was happening. There were then internal coaches, and this was where they trained people on a program very equivalent to our coach training program, so that they had accredited coaches in the organisation who were then enabled to give up a proportion of their time to having coaching conversations. We then, as a company, trained all of their managers in a coaching approach to having one-to-one conversations, and that was a one-day program. So it was a huge commitment. It was a few thousand people that went through that program so that they could develop that. And there was a strong move from telling and knowing to asking and inquiring. Now, it took a long time. This is not an overnight change, but it took a long time. And this particular organisation has recently seen some big recognition for the leadership approach that is taken in the organisation. This is a very different example of something I was involved in the UAE. Oh, I've just got a typo on this slide. And this is where I developed, the challenge was that there were fewer women moving into leadership, and they were curious about how they could develop internal coaches to support women to progress. And so what we did was we ran a 2-day program and developed 20 internal coaches, and they were then committed to having coaching conversations over a 6-month period with women in the organisation. And they saw some great success from this program. They saw people getting promotions, improved relationships with line managers, increased visibility. So the things that we see make a real impact to people in being able to progress in organisations. So in this piece, here are the ways that I would see the best way to go about building a coaching culture. So let's start with the organisation. It's really important to engage senior leaders. And if you have senior leaders who are a bit resistant, then, as I said, find a way for them to have some experience of executive coaching, either by going on a leadership program that has coaching as a part of it, or getting them a dedicated coach. You can develop a coaching culture strategy that would outline what are the actions you're going to take, always remembering that strategy is only as good as the behaviours that then follow, and won't solve any of the problems itself. The other thing you can do actually is start with the leaders in the organisation and encourage them to coach, so get them trained up as coaches so that they can then coach other people, either by doing an introductory course or a full-on accreditation. We have some people on our accredited program who are senior leaders who have come because they want to develop their own coaching approach to leadership. For teams and managers, you can do the different things I've talked about. You can train managers in a coaching skills approach. You can look for team meetings. You can make sure that coaching is a part of one-to-one and regular processes, and that it's also embedded in your performance management systems. And then finally, for individuals, you can look for ways to encourage a growth mindset and encourage peer coaching. And if you're interested in peer coaching, we ran a webinar on this about a year ago, and the webinar is on our YouTube page so that you can go and see that. So let's do our final poll. How ready are you to start using a coaching approach in your own organisation? And while we're doing this, this is also an opportunity now, if you have any questions, to ask any more questions before I come on to a piece. So there's somebody here said, how do you create a coaching culture where there are 4 generations in the workplace? Well, actually, get them coaching each other is actually the best way. So PwC did a big piece of work a couple of years ago now, where they required a senior partner to be coached by a millennial, and both ways. And they said it had such a good impact on the culture of the organisation. So coaching each other is there. So let me share the results. So many of you are saying that you're ready, with a couple of people saying, actually, I'm still not ready, so still some more work to do. But it's good. I would really encourage you to really see how you can move towards developing a coaching culture in your organisation. So just a few final thoughts about how you might do this and how we do this. We run a coaching skills for managers program, which we deliver either in a face-to-face environment. We run 1, 2, and 3 day programs, so obviously with more and more depth. But we also run that virtually. We use the virtual platform Zoom. We have everybody on camera in breakout rooms, and that's worked very, very well. We've seen a lot of success with managers coming for sort of 1.5 to 2 hours, learn one of the skills. Listening's the first one, then go away and practice it and come back next week, and then we'll learn questioning. And we've seen a lot of evidence of that program of really making an impact for people in being confident to use a coaching approach as a leader. And so the 1 day program, for example, we provide in-depth information and practice. It's heavily skills practiced on the core coaching skills, and we really help them to be confident in that space. As I've mentioned, we also run a coach certification program, which is accredited with the ICF, the International Coach Federation. I'll just take a minute to share the details of this with you as well. So our program is focused on coaching in the workplace. It's not a life coaching, it's a workplace coaching program. And the people who have attended so far, as you can see here, have come from a really wide range of roles and levels within the organisation. And we see a lot of leaders and managers coming on the program. And we also, because the program is completely virtual, have a global reach. We have people from as far as Sydney and the UK. I know some of you here on the call from the UAE today. We've had some participants from Dubai joining the program. And because as I say, we're using this virtual platform, people build relationships with each other where it appears that the distance and the time zones don't matter so much. So the program is 100% virtual. It's backed up by a classroom website where people have calendars, and all the resources and the decks and all the things that they need are shared there in that space. And you can access it from your phone. We ran a group last night. A couple of people were still getting home from work. They're dialing in from the taxi on their way. And what we do in the program is we teach people to be effective at coaching people in the workplace and in organisations and around their careers. And it's heavily practice-based. I believe strongly that coaching is a skill best learnt through practice. And so we provide practice, practice, practice. And people are saying that they come out at the end of the program feeling really confident to coach. And just a couple of other pieces of this. We run regular preview sessions of the coaching of the coaching program about it using Zoom, so you get to experience it and see what it's like. I run those sessions myself, and if you'd like to join one of those sessions, we've got a few coming up before the end of the year. You can find them on our website, baileybalfour.com. We've got 2 cohorts starting in the new year. So if anybody doesn't have any questions, then I will stay on the line for a minute, but I'd like to say thank you very much for joining the session today, and I really wish you well with building a coaching culture in your organisation.